You won't regret it, I promise. Subscribe. The door slammed against the kitchen wall with a crack that made me drop my coffee mug. David burst through without knocking, his leather jacket scraping against the doorframe as he stumbled forward. His bloodshot eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal's, and his trembling hands fumbled with the zipper of that worn jacket he'd owned for 15 years. "Dad, I need money." The words tumbled out before he'd even caught his breath. "$25,000 tonight." I set down my half-empty mug next to the scattered mail on the kitchen table, keeping my weathered hand steady despite the shock. The evening light streaming through the window behind me cast long shadows across his disheveled face. His shirt was wrinkled, untucked, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there last month. 25,000. I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle in my stomach. "What kind of trouble are you in now, son?" David began pacing, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor in an erratic rhythm. He couldn't sit still, couldn't even look me in the eye. His fist cracked against the wooden table surface, making the salt shaker jump. "It's complicated. Okay, some business deal went wrong, and I need to make it right fast. Business deal." I kept my voice level, though my jaw tightened. "Or gambling debt." His face flushed red, and he spun to face me, blocking the kitchen entrance with his broad shoulders. "It's not your business what it is. I just need the money, and I know you have it from selling the farm." "The farm?" 3 generations of Carver sweat and blood sold last year to pay for my retirement. The money was supposed to last me through whatever years I had left, not disappear into some casino's coffers, because my 38-year-old son couldn't control himself. "David." I moved closer to him, noting how his hand shook when he thought I wasn't looking. "How much do you owe them?" "Them?" His voice cracked on the word. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The people who have you this scared. The ones who sent you here at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, looking like you haven't slept in a week." He ran his fingers through his greasy hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. "Dad, please. You don't understand. These aren't the kind of people who wait around for payment plans." I'd heard variations of this speech before. Last year it was $12,000 for a sure thing at the track. The year before, $8,000 for poker debts. Each time David promised it would be the last time, that he'd learned his lesson, that he was done with gambling forever. "No, son." I straightened my shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "Not this time." His face went white, then red again. "What do you mean, not this time? I'm your son, which is exactly why I'm saying no." I walked to the sink, turning my back on him deliberately. "Every dollar I give you disappears into some slot machine or poker game. I won't enable this anymore." "Enable?" The word exploded from his lips like a curse. "I'm asking my father for help, and you call it enabling?" "I call it what it is." I turned around, gripping the edge of the counter. "You're 38 years old, David. When are you going to stop running the daddy? Every time you make a mess of your life." He stared at me for a long moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then something cold crept into his expression, something I'd never seen before in my son's face. "You'll regret this, old man." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the menace in it made my blood run cold. "You think you're so high and mighty, sitting on all that farm money while your own son is in trouble? Well, maybe it's time someone taught you what real trouble looks like." Before I could respond, he turned and stalked toward the door, his boots heavy against the floor. The screen door banged shut behind him, and through the window, I watched him climb into his battered pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a sound that rattled the kitchen windows. I stood in the doorway, watching his taillights disappear down the gravel road that led back to town. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the settling sounds of the old house around me. I spent the weekend avoiding the kitchen where Friday's confrontation had taken place, keeping myself busy with yard work and small repairs around the house. Every time I walked past that doorway, I could still hear David's voice. "You'll regret this, old man." The threat echoed in my mind as I read leaves and checked the fence line twice, trying not to think about the cold look in my son's eyes. Monday morning found me in my favorite armchair in the living room, nursing a cup of coffee that was growing cold on the side table. The old rotary phone on its wooden stand began ringing and exactly 10:15. Its shrill tone cutting through the quiet house like a blade. "Hello, Dad." David's voice sounded different, warmer, almost cheerful. The harsh edge from Friday night had been replaced by something that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "Hey, I wanted to call and apologize for the other night. I was way out of line." I paused, raising my eyebrows at no one in particular. In 38 years, David had never called to apologize for anything without being prompted. My grip on the phone receiver tightened. "Really? This is unexpected." I know. He laughed, but it sounded forced, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and you're absolutely right. I can't keep coming to you every time I mess up. It's not fair to you." I glanced at the family photos on the mantel, pictures of David as a child, back when his biggest worry was whether he'd caught enough fireflies for his jar. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. "We've been through this many times, son. This time will be different. I promise." The enthusiasm in his voice was almost convincing. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Linda and I want to have you over for dinner Wednesday night. She's making that pot roast you like with a little potatoes. We thought it might be nice to spend some time together as a family." Linda's pot roast was indeed excellent, and I found myself considering the offer despite my better judgment. Maybe his wife's influence was finally starting to show. She'd always been the steadier one in their marriage, the voice of reason when David's impulses got the better of him. "Wednesday night," I repeated, reaching for a pen from the drawer in the side table. "What time?" 6:30. "We're at 142 Alder Street now. We moved last month. Remember I told you about the new place?" He hadn't told me about any new place, but I didn't correct him. "It's the blue house with the white shutters right across from the elementary school." I wrote down the address on a napkin, noting how quickly he rattled off the details. Most people pause when giving directions to their own home, visualizing the route or double-checking house numbers in their mind. David spoke like he was reading from a piece of paper. "Linda's really excited about having you over," he continued. "She keeps talking about how we need to be a real family again. You know how she is about family dinners and traditions." That much was true. Linda had always been the one to organize holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations, usually over David's protests that such things were too much trouble. It was one of the things I genuinely liked about my daughter-in-law. "Well," I said slowly, staring at the address I'd written, "I suppose I could come by." "Great. That's just great, Dad. We'll see you Wednesday at 6:30. And Dad, thanks for giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone and staring at the napkin in my other hand. Something about the conversation felt rehearsed, like David had practiced every word before dialing my number. But then again, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe he'd finally realized he needed to put real effort into rebuilding our relationship. Maybe Linda had convinced him to swallow his pride and make things right. I hung up the phone and looked at the address again. 142 Alder Street. The paper felt light in my fingers, but somehow the weight of the decision pressed down on my chest like a stone. The evening news droned in the background as I picked up my dinner, David's invitation weighing on my mind like an anchor. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the napkin on the coffee table where I'd written the address. 142 Alder Street. Even after I'd turned off the television and made my rounds through the house, checking locks with more care than usual, those numbers followed me. By 10 o'clock, I found myself lying on my bed, fully dressed, except for my shoes, staring at the ceiling fan as it cast shifting shadows across the walls. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed green in the darkness. 10:47, then 11:23, then 11:58. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face from Friday night. Not the apologetic voice from today's phone call, but the cold stranger who threatened me in my own kitchen. The son I'd raised would never have looked at me that way. But then again, the son I'd raised wouldn't have needed $25,000 from loan sharks either. I thought about the last time David had called me from a casino 2 in the morning, his words slurred from whatever he'd been drinking. "Dad, I need a ride home. My truck won't start." When I'd arrived, I'd found him stumbling around the parking lot, his wallet empty, and his pride nowhere to be found. He'd slept in my passenger seat the entire drive home, snoring like the little boy who used to fall asleep during long car trips to visit his grandmother. The boy who'd spent summer afternoons in my garage, handing me tools and asking endless questions about engines and carburetors. The teenager who'd proudly shown me his first paycheck from the hardware store. The young man who'd promised to make something of himself, to be better than the small town life he'd inherited. When had that boy disappeared? When had gambling become more important than family, more important than self-respect? I got up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where David's truck had peeled out 3 nights ago. The pavement was empty now, lit only by the single street light at the corner. Somewhere out there, my son was planning something. I could feel it in my bones, the way I used to sense storms coming across the farmland. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe today's phone call had been genuine. Maybe Linda really had convinced him to change, to make an effort at rebuilding what we'd lost. She was a good woman, steady and practical in ways that David had never learned to be. If anyone could straighten him out, it would be her. I returned to the bed and picked up the framed photo from my nightstand. David, at age 12, grinning gap-toothed next to the go-kart we built together in the garage. His hands were dirty with motor oil, and his eyes sparkled with the pure joy of accomplishment. That boy had believed anything was possible if you worked hard enough for it. Maybe some part of that boy still existed. Maybe Wednesday night's dinner would be the first step toward finding him again. The clock read 12:34 when I finally felt my eyelids growing heavy. I clutched the photo against my chest and let myself drift towards sleep. Though an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite name continued to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. For now, I had to try to trust that my son still existed somewhere inside the desperate man who'd stood in my kitchen demanding money. Sometimes you have to try. Sometimes trust is all a father has left. Tuesday morning found me standing at the kitchen sink with my coffee mug, staring out at the street through the window above the faucet. Sleep had been elusive after Monday night's phone call, my mind cycling between hope and skepticism like a broken record. David's voice had sounded so earnest, but 38 years of watching my son had taught me to distinguish between genuine remorse and practiced performance. The unfamiliar truck caught my attention immediately. It sat parked where no vehicle usually belonged, across from Mrs. Collins's mailbox, positioned with a clear view of my driveway. The morning dew still clung to its windshield, suggesting it had been there overnight. I noticed it yesterday evening when I'd stepped out to bring in the garbage cans, but assumed it belonged to someone visiting the neighborhood. Through the driver's side window, I could make out a figure hunched over the steering wheel. The man's fingers drummed nervously against the dashboard, and every few seconds, he'd glance up and down the street as if checking for something or someone. I set my coffee down and walked outside, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The morning air was crisp, filled with the sounds of birds and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. As I approached the truck, I could see the man more clearly, middle-aged with thinning hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. Knocking gently on the driver's window, I waited as the man jumped slightly and rolled down the glass. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a nervous energy about him that reminded me of a rabbit caught in headlights. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone friendly and neighborly. "Everything okay? I noticed you've been parked here since yesterday." "Oh, yes, sir. Everything's fine." The man's voice pitched slightly higher than seemed natural, and he avoided direct eye contact, just having some engine trouble, waiting for it to cool down before I tried starting her up again. I glanced at the truck's Nevada license plates, which struck me as odd for someone having car trouble in a Portland neighborhood. Engine trouble? I've got some mechanical experience if you need a hand. Spent 40 years working on everything from farm equipment to pickup trucks. No, that's very kind of you, but I think it's more of an electrical issue. Or maybe the carburetor. He fumbled with his explanation, contradicting himself before the words were fully out of his mouth. "I've got a buddy coming to take a look at it later." The tools visible on the truck bed suggested he might actually know something about automotive repair, but his nervous demeanor told a different story. I could see him gripping the steering wheel tighter as our conversation continued, knuckles white against the worn vinyl. "Well, If you change your mind, I'm right across the street. Name's Walter Carver. I gestured toward my house, noting how his eyes followed the movement with intense interest. There's a good mechanic shop about 2 miles down Knee Sandy Boulevard. If your buddy can't make it out, that's real generous of you, Mr. Carver. Real generous. He seemed eager to end our conversation, already reaching for the window crank. I'm sure we'll get it sorted out soon enough. All right then. I stepped back from the truck, but something about the entire interaction felt wrong. The man's explanation had been too detailed for someone with genuine car trouble, and his nervousness seemed disproportionate to a simple mechanical problem. You take care now. Walking back toward my house, I found myself looking over my shoulder at the truck one more time. The man had already rolled up his window and was back to drumming his fingers on the dashboard, occasionally glancing at my property with what looked like calculated interest rather than casual observation. I'd finished my coffee standing by the kitchen window, watching the truck and trying to shake the feeling that I'd just been lied to by a complete stranger. The license plate number stuck in my mind, JKL 4729, though I couldn't say exactly why I felt it might be important to remember. By noon, when I went out to check the mail, the truck was gone. Wednesday arrived with the kind of spring weather that made everything seem possible. I'd spent most of the day alternating between anticipation and apprehension, the truck incident from yesterday morning fading to a background concern as evening approached. David's dinner invitation had consumed my thoughts, and despite my reservations, I found myself genuinely hoping this might be the beginning of something better between us. At 5:30, I began preparing for the evening. My navy blue suit came out of the closet, slightly worn at the elbows, but still dignified enough for a family dinner. I polished my leather shoes until they reflected the bedroom light, selected a conservative tie, and checked my wallet to ensure I had enough cash should the evening call for it. From my small wine collection in the basement, I chose a bottle of Cabernet that had been waiting for a special occasion. The mirror reflected a man trying to look his best for his son, and the sight both pleased and saddened me. How long had it been since we'd shared a meal without tension? How many years since David had invited me anywhere without needing something in return? Stepping outside at 6 o'clock, I nearly collided with Frank Doyle, who was watering the flower bed that bordered our properties. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw my formal attire. "Well, now don't you look sharp this evening, Walter? Special occasion." David invited me to dinner. I held up the wine bottle with what I hoped was casual confidence. First time in quite a while that we've done something this. Frank's expression softened with genuine warmth. "That's wonderful news. Family's the most important thing we've got, especially our age. I'm glad to hear you two are working things out. We'll see how it goes." I appreciated his optimism, even if I couldn't fully share it. You know how these things can be. "I do indeed." He turned off his garden hose and leaned against the fence post. "But sometimes all it takes is someone extending a hand first." Sounds like David's trying to do that. The drive to David's neighborhood took me through the familiar streets of Portland, across the bridge that spanned the Willamette River. I'd driven these roads countless times over the years, but tonight they seemed different somehow, like I was traveling towards something significant rather than simply going from one place to another. David's new address led me into a subdivision I rarely visited, where the houses were newer and the lawns more manicured than in my older neighborhood. The homes here suggested a level of prosperity that surprised me, given David's recent financial troubles. How was he affording a place like this? 142 Alder Street turned out to be a blue house with white shutters, exactly as David had described. The lawn was neatly trimmed and warm light glowed from the windows, creating the picture of domestic contentment. I parked behind a silver sedan that I assumed belonged to Linda, taking a moment to check my appearance in the rearview mirror. The wine bottle felt heavier in my hand as I walked up the front path. Through the large picture window, I could see movement inside, figures preparing for my arrival. The porch light came on as I approached the door, and I realized David must have been watching for me. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the doorbell and waited. This was it, the moment when we discover whether my son's invitation had been genuine or just another performance in a long series of disappointments. The sound of footsteps approached from inside, quick and eager. The door opened before the bell had finished chiming. David's smile was so wide it looked painful, stretching across his face with an intensity that immediately put me on guard. Before I could fully step onto the porch, he'd pulled the door open completely and was reaching forward to shake my hand with both of his. "Dad, you made it right on time, just like always." His voice carried that same artificially cheerful tone from Monday's phone call, pitched slightly higher than his normal speaking voice. Come in. Linda's been cooking all afternoon." Linda appeared beside him almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting just inside the doorway. Her hands fluttered nervously as she reached for the wine bottle, and I noticed they trembled slightly when she took it from me. "Mr. Carver, it's so good to see you. This is such a beautiful wine. You really didn't need to bring anything, but it's so thoughtful." The words tumbled out of her mouth in a breathless rush, as she clutched the bottle against her chest like a shield. The interior of the house struck me immediately as overly prepared. Every surface gleamed with fresh cleaning, and I could smell the lingering scent of furniture polish mixed with cooking aromas. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on the coffee table, expensive-looking roses that seemed out of place in David's typically casual lifestyle. "Let me take your jacket, Dad." David was already behind me, helping me out of my suit coat with the kind of attentive service I'd never experienced from him before. "You look great, really sharp. That tie brings out your eyes." The dining room had been transformed into something resembling a magazine photograph. China plates I'd never seen before were arranged with mathematical precision, flanked by silverware that caught the light from multiple candles scattered across the table. The overall effect was beautiful, but it felt more like a stage set than a family dinner. "David tells me you haven't seen the house since we moved in," Linda said, leading me toward the dining area. "We've done so much work on it. David's been incredibly handy with all the improvements." I followed her, noting how she avoided direct eye contact while speaking. Her movements were quick and efficient, but there was an underlying tension in the way she held her shoulders, as if she was bracing herself for something. The meal itself was impressive. Perfectly prepared steak, creamy mashed potatoes, and green beans that were still crisp. Everything was served on those unfamiliar china plates, and David made a show of opening my wine with a corkscrew that looked like it had been purchased specifically for the occasion. "A toast?" David announced, raising his glass with theatrical flourish. "To second chances in family, to putting the past behind us and moving forward together." The wine was good, but I found myself studying my son's face as he drank. His eyes kept darting to his watch, quick glances that he probably thought I wouldn't notice. Each time he checked the time, his smile seemed to tighten slightly around the edges. "Tell me about your work, David." I cut into my steak, which was cooked exactly how I preferred it. "Things going better for you lately?" "Much better, Dad, much better." He launched into a vague description of consulting work and new opportunities that sounded rehearsed and completely lacking in specifics. "I've really turned things around, Linda can tell you. I'm a different person now." Lee nodded enthusiastically, but her smile looked strained. "He's been working so hard, really dedicated to making positive changes." Her hands were busy throughout the conversation, constantly serving more food, refilling water glasses, and adjusting napkins that didn't need adjusting. The conversation felt choreographed, with both David and Linda steering away from any topics that might lead to uncomfortable territory. When I asked about their finances or David's specific employment, the answers became even more evasive, filled with generalities and quick subject changes. "Remember when you taught me to change the oil in that old Buick?" David's laugh sounded forced as he launched into a carefully selected childhood memory. I must have spilled more oil on the garage floor than actually made it into the engine. These shared recollections felt different from natural family reminiscing, too polished, too deliberately chosen to present David in the most favorable light possible. It was as if he prepared a mental list of safe, positive memories to deploy whenever the conversation threatened to veer toward recent difficulties. Throughout the meal, I became increasingly aware that I was watching a performance rather than participating in genuine family time. Both David and Linda seemed to be working from a script, hitting predetermined emotional beats with the precision of actors who'd rehearsed their roles extensively. My phone rang as we were finishing the main course, its shrill tone cutting through David's story about potential business expansion opportunities. Both David and Linda froze for a fraction of a second before David's expression shifted to forced casualness. "Go ahead and answer it, Dad. Don't mind us." But as I reached for the phone, I caught something in David's eyes, a flash of genuine panic that he couldn't quite hide behind his practiced smile. My phone's sharp ring sliced through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk. David's fork paused midway to his mouth, and Lynn's hands froze while reaching for the wine bottle. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the continued ringing that seemed louder with each pulse. "Sorry, let me just check who this is." I reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the vibration against my fingers. The caller ID showed Frank Doyle, and I felt a small surge of warmth seeing my neighbor's name. "Go ahead and answer it, Dad. Don't mind us." David's voice carried that same artificial cheerfulness from earlier, but I caught something else underneath, a tightness that hadn't been there moments before. "Frank, what can I do for you?" I stepped slightly away from the table, phone pressed to my ear, trying to maintain dinner etiquette while David and Linda watched with expressions that seemed too carefully composed. "Walter, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Frank's familiar growly voice came through clearly, tinged with concern. "I was just wondering, are you home tonight? I thought I saw your car in the driveway earlier, but now I'm not so sure." "No, I'm actually at David's place for dinner." "Why? Is everything okay?" The words felt strange in my mouth, and I noticed David gripping his wine glass tighter, knuckles whitening against the crystal. There was a pause on Frank's end, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of alarm that made my stomach clench. "Walter, there are lights moving around inside your house. Not normal lights, flashlight beams, like someone searching through rooms. I've been watching for about 10 minutes now." The fork slipped from David's fingers, clattering against his plate with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet dining room. Lynn's face had gone pale, and she was clutching the wine bottle like an anchor. "What do you mean lights moving around?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking the words. "Are you certain?" "Dead certain. I was out checking my mailbox when I noticed them. First in your living room, then the kitchen. Now they're upstairs. Whoever it is, they're being systematic about it. Should I call the police?" The room around me seemed to tilt slightly, and I felt my free hand instinctively reach for my car keys in my pocket. "Yes, call the police. I'm coming home right now. Be careful, Walter. I don't know if they're still inside or not. I'll keep watching from my window until you get here." I ended the call and looked up to find David and Linda staring at me with expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. David's mouth hung slightly open, and Linda was still holding dishes she'd been clearing, frozen like a statue. "Someone's in my house," I announced, already moving toward where I'd left my jacket. "I need to get home right now." David's response came too quickly, his laughter pitched too high and too loud for the small dining room. "Oh, come on, Dad. Old Frank's probably just seeing tree shadows or something. You know how he gets, always thinking he's still on guard duty from his army days." The dismissive tone in my son's voice struck me wrong, especially coming so fast after Frank's worried call. I paused in putting on my jacket, studying David's face in the flickering candlelight. His smile looked strained, and there was something desperate in his eyes. "Frank's not confused, David. He knows the difference between shadows and flashlight beams moving through a house." I pulled my jacket on fully, checking that my keys were secure. "Someone's robbing my home while I'm sitting here eating dinner. Dad, please." Linda's voice was barely above a whisper, and her hands were trembling as she set down the dishes she'd been holding. Maybe there's some explanation. But I was already moving toward the front door, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be happening to my belongings, my memories, everything I'd worked for years. The timing felt wrong, too convenient, but I pushed that thought aside in favor of getting home to assess the situation. David rose from his chair so quickly it nearly toppled backward, his face shifting from fake concern to something that looked almost like panic. David's movement to block my path was swift but clumsy. his desperation finally breaking through the careful facade he'd maintained all evening. His hands came up in what might have been meant as a casual gesture, but his body language screamed panic. "Whoa, hold on there, Dad. You're getting all worked up over nothing." His laughter rang false in the small space, echoing off the walls with an edge of hysteria. Frank's 72 years old. The man probably can't see his own hand in front of his face at night. I stopped moving toward the door, not because David's words made sense, but because something in his tone reminded me of the boy who used to lie about broken windows and missing cookies. The same overeager explanations, the same desperate need to be believed, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. "David, move aside." I kept my voice level, but firm. Frank's eyesight is fine, and he's not the type to call about shadows. Eyesight. Someone is in my house. Look, okay, maybe he did see something. David repositioned himself more squarely between me and the door, his hands now openly placed on my shoulders, in a gesture that felt more restraining than comforting. But think about it logically. If someone was really robbing houses, wouldn't they pick a time when people aren't having dinner? Wouldn't they case the place first to make sure nobody's around? The words hit me strangely, too specific and knowledgeable for someone trying to reassure a worried father. I looked up at my son's face and saw something I'd never seen before. The cold calculation of someone who knew exactly what was happening and was desperate to prevent me from discovering it. "How do you know they didn't case the place?" The question came out before I could stop it, and I watched David's expression flicker with something that might have been fear. "I don't. That's what criminals do, right? They plan these things out." His grip on my shoulders tightened, and I realized he was physically preventing me from moving forward. "Dad, please, let's just finish dinner and then drive over together. I'll come with you to check everything out." Behind David, Linda had gone completely still, a dish towel clutched in her white-knuckled hands. When our eyes met, she looked away immediately, and not before I caught the guilt written across her features as clearly as if she'd confessed aloud. "Get out of my way, son." The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying decades of parental authority that David had always responded to as a child. "I'm going to check on my house now." "Dad, you're being unreasonable. Think about this rationally." Rationally, I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Rationally would be trusting my neighbor's word over the protests of a son who's lied to me more times than I can count. David's face flushed red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he moved even more directly into my path, using his size advantage to create a wall between me and the exit. "You're not going anywhere until we talk this through properly." His voice had dropped to a tone I'd never heard from him before. Cold, threatening, nothing like the desperate boy who'd sat in my kitchen 5 days ago, begging for money. David William Carver. I used his full name the way I had when he was a child and had crossed a line that demanded immediate correction. "You will step aside and let me leave this house right now. Or what? You'll call the cops on your own son?" He was breathing heavily, and I could smell the wine on his breath, mixed with something that might have been fear. "You'll destroy our family over some old man's paranoid fantasies." But even as he spoke, I saw his eyes dart to the front door, then to his watch, then to Linda. The pattern was too specific to be casual anxiety. He was tracking time, measuring it against something else, something that required me to stay exactly where I was for a predetermined period. "It's not paranoid if someone's actually in my house, David." I took a step forward, testing his resolve. "And if you don't let me pass, I'm going to start wondering why my own son is so determined to keep me away from home on the exact night someone decides to rob it." The accusation hung in the air between us like poison gas, and I watched my son's face go through a series of micro-expressions: shock, guilt, anger, and finally, a desperate sort of resignation that told me everything I needed to know. David's hand shot forward and twisted the deadbolt with a sharp metallic click that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air between us, final and unmistakable in its meaning. He pocketed the key with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're not leaving, Dad. Not until we figure this out." The simple statement carried more menace than any threat he could have made. I stared at my son, this stranger wearing David's face, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by someone capable of locking his own father in a house while accomplices ransacked the family home. David. My voice was steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. Unlock that door right now. I can't do that. He leaned back against the door, arms crossed, no longer bothering to maintain even the pretense of concern. Not until you calm down and listen to reason. Behind him, Linda had pressed herself against the dining room wall, the dish towel still clutched in her hands. Her face showed the kind of horror that comes from watching someone you thought you knew transform into someone unrecognizable. Listen to reason. I kept my voice calm, though every instinct screamed at me to force my way past him. Son, you just locked me in your house against my will while someone robs mine. What possible reason could justify that? You don't understand the situation you're in. David's tone carried a warning that made my skin crawl. There are people involved in this that you don't want to cross. People who don't forgive debts or accept excuses. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Not just that David had planned this, but that he was willing to sacrifice his own father to solve problems he'd created through his gambling addiction. I thought about the $25,000 he demanded, about the cold look in his eyes when I'd refused, about his promise that I'd regret my decision. I need to use the bathroom, I said quietly. David's expression shifted to suspicion, but basic human decency, or perhaps the last remnants of his upbringing, prevented him from refusing outright. Fine, but don't try anything stupid. The bathroom was at the back of the house, and I knew from previous visits that it had a window facing the backyard. As I closed the door behind me, I could hear David and Linda talking in hushed, urgent voices in the hallway. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was pure panic. The window was older than I'd remembered, with a simple latch that opened easily despite years of paint buildup. The screen came away with minimal noise, and I found myself looking down at a drop of perhaps 6 feet into Linda's flower bed. Not ideal for a 68-year-old man, but manageable if I was careful. Getting through the window required more flexibility than I'd possessed in years, but desperation provided both motivation and strength. I landed heavily in the soft earth of the garden, dirt staining my dinner clothes and small branches catching at my jacket. The impact sent a shock through my knees, but nothing felt broken. Behind me, I could hear David's voice getting louder, more agitated. How long before he realized what had happened? How long before he discovered the open window and empty bathroom? My car sat in the driveway where I'd left it, keys still in my jacket pocket. The engine turned over smoothly, and I backed out of the driveway with careful precision, not wanting to alert the neighbors to anything unusual. It wasn't until I was several blocks away that I allowed myself to fully process what had just occurred. My own son had betrayed me, not just refused to help, not just lied or manipulated, but actively orchestrated a crime against me while pretending to offer reconciliation. The dinner, the apologies, Linda's nervousness, all of it had been theater designed to keep me away from my house while it was being robbed. The drive back to my neighborhood passed in a blur of familiar streets and unfamiliar emotions. Anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness that felt like grief for the son I'd thought I knew. But underneath all of that was something else. A cold determination that David had inherited from me, along with his mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. He'd made a mistake in letting me discover his plan. An even bigger mistake in underestimating what his old man was capable of when pushed too far. I'd spent 40 years working with my hands, solving problems, and dealing with difficult people. My son was about to learn that some lessons come too late to do any good. As I turned onto my street, I could see police lights flashing in the distance, red and blue reflections dancing off the windows of neighboring houses. Frank had kept his word and called the authorities. Now I needed to get home and find out exactly what my son and his accomplice had stolen from me. More importantly, I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. Red and blue lights painted my street in alternating colors as I turned the corner, my heart sinking as I realized the police cars were clustered directly in front of my house. The scene looked like something from a television drama. Multiple patrol vehicles, officers moving with purpose, and neighbors gathered at respectful distances, their faces reflecting the kind of morbid curiosity that comes with unexpected neighborhood excitement. I parked quickly behind the last police car and hurried toward my front door, where Officer Mark Hanley was coordinating what appeared to be the tail end of an investigation. Through the rear window of one patrol car, I could see a slumped figure in handcuffs, head down in the universal posture of defeat. "Mr. Carver." Officer Hanley approached me with the kind of professional calm that suggested he'd been expecting my arrival. "I'm glad you're here. We've got your burglar in custody, and your neighbor, Mr. Doyle, has been extremely helpful in providing details about the incident." Frank was right. The words came out as relief rather than surprise. I looked toward Frank's house and saw him standing by his fence, arms crossed with the satisfied expression of a man whose instincts had been vindicated. Someone really was in my house. "Yes, sir, they were. We apprehended the suspect in your basement, attempting to access what appears to be a safe. He's confessed to breaking and entering, and he's also provided some additional information that I think you'll find disturbing." Officer Hanley guided me toward the patrol car, where the burglar sat hunched in the back seat. Through the window, I could see a thin, pale man in his 40s. The same nervous individual I'd spoken to yesterday morning when he'd been sitting in that truck across from Mrs. Collins's mailbox. His name is Eddie Sloan. Ring any bells? I spoke to him yesterday. He claimed to have car trouble. The memory felt surreal now, knowing I'd offered help to someone who was planning to rob me. He seemed nervous, but I thought he was just stressed about his truck. According to Mr. Sloan, he was hired to commit this burglary. He's been very forthcoming about the details, probably hoping for a reduced sentence. Officer Hanley's expression grew more serious. "Mr. Carver, he claims your son David arranged this entire operation." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though some part of me had been expecting them since the moment I'd realized David was preventing me from leaving his house. Hearing it confirmed by law enforcement made it undeniably real. David hired him to rob my house while I was at dinner. The statement came out flat, emotionless, as my mind struggled to process the full extent of my son's betrayal. "That's what he's telling us. Says David promised him $5,000 to get into your safe and retrieve $25,000 in cash. When we arrested him, he immediately started talking about how David had set up the dinner invitation specifically to keep you away from the house during the burglary." I walked closer to the patrol car and looked directly at Eddie Sloan. When he finally raised his eyes to meet mine, I saw shame and fear, but no real remorse. This was a man who'd been caught, not one who regretted his actions. "Did you get into the safe?" I asked Officer Hanley, though I was still staring at the burglar. "No, sir. Your basement door was locked, and by the time he got it open, Mr. Doyle had already called us. He fled back upstairs when he heard our sirens, but we had the house surrounded. The safe shows tool marks where he attempted to force it, but it held secure. We walked down to my basement, where I could see the evidence of Eddie's failed attempt. My old Mosser safe, installed by my father 40 years ago, stood intact despite obvious signs of tampering. Tools were scattered around it: a crowbar, screwdrivers, what looked like a small drill. Evidence of desperation rather than professional expertise. "Everything appears to be undisturbed," Officer Hanley said, making notes on a clipboard. "But we'll need you to check thoroughly once we've finished processing the scene." Back outside, Frank approached with the measured stride of a man who'd been proven absolutely right about something important. His handshake was firm, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "I told you that truck looked suspicious," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Been watching that Sloan character since Tuesday morning. Something about him just didn't sit right. Too nervous, too interested in your house specifically. You saved my life savings, Frank, if you hadn't called when you did." I trailed off, not wanting to think about what $25,000 would have meant to my retirement security. Any neighbor would have done the same thing. But his pride was evident and well-deserved. The important thing now is making sure this doesn't happen again, and making sure everyone involved faces appropriate consequences. Officer Hanley approached us again, his expression grave. "Mr. Carver, we're heading to your son's house now to place him under arrest. Given Mr. Sloan's confession and the evidence we've gathered, We have enough for charges of conspiracy to commit burglary, among other things. I need to ask, do you want to press full charges against your son?" I looked back at my house, thinking about the violation of trust, the elaborate deception, the cold calculation required to rob your own father. Then I looked at Frank, who'd risked his own safety to protect me and my property. Yes, the word came out hard and final. I want full charges pressed against David Carver and against anyone else involved in this conspiracy. The drive to David's neighborhood felt different this time. Not the hopeful journey of a father seeking reconciliation, but the grim procession of justice finally catching up with deception. I followed the police convoy at a respectful distance, watching the red and blue lights reflect off house windows as we moved through the quiet streets of Portland. David's house was blazing with lights when we arrived, every window illuminated, as if he was trying to push back the darkness that was closing in around him. Through the large picture window, I could see frantic movement. David pacing like a caged animal, Lynn moving between rooms with what looked like suitcases in her hands. Officer Hanley positioned his units strategically around the house, professional and methodical in creating a perimeter that would prevent any escape attempt. I parked across the street, close enough to witness justice, but far enough to stay out of the way of police operations. The front door opened before Officer Hanley could knock. Linda stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, looking like someone who'd been crying for hours. Behind her, David was visible, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate expression of a man whose careful plans had collapsed completely. "Mrs. Carver, we have a warrant for your husband's arrest." Officer Hanley's voice carried easily across the quiet street, professional but firm. "Is David Carver inside?" "He's here." Linda's voice was barely audible, but she stepped aside to allow the officer's entry. "He's been expecting you." David appeared in the doorway, no longer the manipulative son who tried to charm me into compliance just hours earlier. His shirt was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his hands shook visibly as Officer Hanley began reading his rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is ridiculous." David's voice cracked as the handcuffs clicked into place. "You're destroying a family over some old man's paranoid fantasies. My father doesn't know what he's talking about. David William Carver, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit burglary, solicitation of criminal activity, and conspiracy to commit theft." Officer Hanley's tone remained professional despite David's protests. "Your accomplice has provided detailed testimony about your role in planning and financing this operation." "Accomplice? What accomplice? I don't know what you're talking about." But even as David denied everything, his eyes darted toward the patrol cars, and I knew he was looking for Eddie Sloan, hoping against hope that his hired burglar hadn't betrayed him. Linda stood in the doorway, watching her husband's arrest with an expression that combined horror and resignation. When David looked to her for support, she took a deliberate step backward, distancing herself, both physically and emotionally, from the man she'd married. "Linda, tell them this is crazy. Tell them I was with you all evening." David's voice was rising to a desperate pitch. "You know I didn't do anything wrong. I know you locked your father in our house." Her voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I know you hired someone to rob him while you kept him away from home. I know you planned this whole thing because he wouldn't give you money for your gambling debts." The admission hung in the air like a confession in church, final and damning. David's face went white, then red, then white again as he realized his own wife was refusing to provide him with an alibi. "You don't understand what you're doing." He struggled against the handcuffs as officers guided him toward the patrol car. "There are people involved in this that you can't protect me from. If I can't pay them back, then you should have thought of that before you tried to steal from your own father." Lee interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Before you turned our marriage into part of your criminal schemes." As David was placed in the back of the patrol car, I could see him through the window, still talking desperately to anyone who would listen, still trying to manipulate his way out of consequences he'd brought entirely upon himself. But the door closed on his protests, and suddenly the street was quiet again, except for the radio chatter of police communications. Officer Hanley approached my car as the convoy prepared to leave. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to finalize your statement, Mr. Carver, but the case is solid. Between Mr. Sloane's confession and Mrs. Carver's corroboration, your son will be facing serious charges." I nodded, watching the patrol car containing David disappear around the corner. 38 years of fatherhood, and it had come to this. My son handcuffed in the back of a police car, facing prison time for trying to rob his own father. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal as the police cars departed, porch lights dimming and curtains falling back into place. But for the Carver family, nothing would ever be normal again. 2 days had passed since the arrests, and Friday afternoon found me sitting on my front porch with Frank, sharing a quiet beer and watching the neighborhood settle into its weekend rhythm. The media attention had faded, the police tape had been removed, and life in Portland was returning to its comfortable predictability. "Court called this morning," I told Frank, taking a sip from my can and enjoying the simple pleasure of peaceful conversation. "David got 5 years probation, full restitution, and 500 hours of community service. Judge said the family nature of the crime was an aggravating fact, not a mitigating one." Frank nodded approvingly. "Sounds about right. What about the other fellow, Sloane?" 2 years in county prison. Judge wasn't as lenient with him being a repeat offender and all. I looked across the street where the empty space in front of Mrs. Collins's house reminded me of where this whole drama had started. Funny thing is, I almost feel sorry for David. Almost counts for something, I suppose. Frank sat down his beer and leaned back in his chair. "Shows you're still his father even after everything that happened." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, the kind that only comes between friends who've been through something significant together. Frank had become more than just a neighbor over the past few days. He'd proven himself to be the kind of person you want living next door when trouble comes calling. "I keep thinking about that Tuesday morning," Frank said eventually. "Something about that truck just bothered me, you know? Couldn't put my finger on it at first, but it was like watching someone case a house in broad daylight. Your instincts were spot on. If you hadn't been paying attention, if you hadn't called when you did." I shook my head, not wanting to dwell on what might have happened. "Those savings represent 40 years of work, Frank. My entire retirement fund was in that safe. Well, it's still there, and that's what matters." He gestured toward my house with obvious satisfaction. "And now you know your home security is solid. That old safe of your father's proved its worth." I'd spent the previous day upgrading my security system, installing motion sensors, and improving the locks on my doors and windows. Not out of paranoia, but out of practical acknowledgement that trust, once broken, needed to be rebuilt gradually and with appropriate precautions. Heard from Lynn yesterday. I mentioned knowing Frank would be interested in the aftermath. She's filing for divorce. Said she can't be married to someone who'd victimize his own family for gambling money. Smart woman. She seemed like she was caught in the middle of something she never signed up for. Frank's tone was sympathetic. "Any word on whether David's getting help for his gambling problem?" "Court-mandated counseling is part of his probation, whether it takes or not." I shrugged, trying to balance hope with realism. "I suppose that's up to him now. I can't fix him, and I can't keep enabling him by bailing him out of trouble." The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in days, I felt truly relaxed. The crisis was over. Justice had been served, and life could move forward. Not the same as before. Trust, once shattered, leaves permanent scars, but forward nonetheless. "You know what the strangest part of all this was?" I asked Frank. "That dinner on Wednesday night. Sitting there watching David and Lynn perform like actors in a play, knowing something felt wrong but not being able to identify what it was. Parental instincts." Frank said simply, "You raise that boy so you know when he's being genuine and when he's putting on an act. The problem was you wanted to believe he changed." Exactly. I wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored the evidence right in front of me. I finished my beer and set the empty can on the small table between our chairs. "Won't make that mistake again." Doesn't mean you stop hoping, though. Just means you hope with your eyes open. As evening approached, neighbors began emerging for their usual weekend activities. Lawn care, dog walking, the general bustle of community life. Mrs. Collins waved from her garden, and the Johnson kids rode their bicycles past my house, their laughter echoing off the quiet street. This was what David had tried to steal from me, I realized. Not just money, but the security that comes from knowing you can age in place, surrounded by people who care about your welfare. Frank's vigilance had protected more than just my savings. It had preserved the peace of mind that makes retirement possible. "Thank you," I said to Frank, the words carrying more weight than casual conversation. "For watching out for me, for trusting your instincts, for being the kind of neighbor everyone deserves." Frank smiled, the expression mixing pride with genuine affection. "That's what neighbors do, Walter. We watch out for each other." He gestured toward the empty street where Eddie's truck had once sat. Besides, it felt good to put those old Army observation skills to use for something worthwhile. The sun was setting behind the houses across the street, painting everything in golden light that suggested peaceful endings and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, on my own front porch, with a friend who'd proven himself when it mattered most, in a neighborhood that had shown its true character when tested. Justice had been served, community had been preserved, and trust, though modified by experience, remained possible between people who earned it honestly. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.